Hello and welcome to the EconBuff podcast. I'm your host, Lee Stitzel. With me today are Brent Evans and Chris Clark of Georgia College. Both are professors of economics. Brent, Chris, welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
So our topic today is the legalization of marijuana and its impact on college basketball and college football recruiting. So gentlemen, I just want to start with the first question. Why is it we would expect these two things to be related at all?
So it's kind of interesting. I don't know how much time you spend around college students, but they occasionally enjoy some marijuana. So let's say that you are considering which school you'd like to play basketball or football with, and you are someone who is maybe interested in marijuana use. Well, you may select a school based on the fact that legalized marijuana is available. There's recreational marijuana in the area. So on the margin, if I'm trying to decide between two schools, one has relatively easy access, one doesn't, and I enjoy it, that may be something that convinces me that's the right school for me. But you could also imagine on the flip side, if you know that you enjoy marijuana, but you don't want to become too engaged in marijuana use, you may actively choose a community where it's not recreationally accessible. So you can imagine it going both directions. So it may be an enticing option. It may also be a deterrent.
Yeah, and to echo that, I think the key word there is on the margins, because these players, they're not getting paid. They don't really have generally a strong feeling of where they should go to college. They're choosing based on things like facilities and do they think they're going to get playing time right away? There's a lot of uncertainty. So something like marijuana legalization may not be that big of a deal to them, but it may be enough to change where they're going to go to college when they're dealing with so much uncertainty to begin with that choice.
Right. And who's the Chick-fil-A guy?
I don't remember his name, but there's a player at Ole Miss. I'm a Mississippi State fan, that's where I went to grad school, and he chose to go to Ole Miss. And one reason he said was because they have a Chick-fil-A. So you can see these types of decisions are very much at the margins, and it's ultra frustrating because we had two Chick-fil-A's in Starkville. I guess that wasn't part of the campus tour.
Yeah.
So, one of the things that I focus on a lot when I'm teaching, especially principles of economics, is decision-making happens on the margin. So I'm actually really glad you brought that up. Just trying to think that, we'll be in the high 40s this episode when it comes out. So it's not as if I started the podcast yesterday. And decision-making on the margin must have been something we've talked about, but I can't remember the last episode that somebody mentioned that. So I really like that. Can you expound on that idea a little bit, kind of walk the listeners through why might it be that, we'd have this list of things that we care about as a college football recruit, facilities and a coach and playing time, and am I going to be on television, and do I get to play against Alabama, and all those things that might really, really matter to us. And somehow whether or not there's a Chick-fil-A on campus versus 10 minutes away from campus can factor into my decision-making. Can you kind of expound on that a little bit?
Yeah. So if we think about, this is a labor market is really all it is. Mm-hmm. And these are athletes that have incredibly high marginal revenue product of labor. But of course, they're not compensated, or at least not supposed to be directly compensated by the institution. So if this was a normal labor market and you were making decisions at the margins, you might get a few job offers and you might negotiate for a little bit of extra money. And that money would basically be that deciding factor when you have a tough choice between two possible opportunities. That's obviously not an option in college athletics. So then that's what leads to this arms race at universities, where they're expanding their weight room, expanding their stadium, trying to make their stadiums look as nice as possible. This is why they pay their coaches so much, is because they can't pay the players. And so the universities are looking for any kind of edge that they could have. So, these players, they're being barraged by a bunch of things that probably, again, only affect them on the margins. You go see a weight room and it's a little bit nicer than another school's weight room. Would that be your deciding factor? You might not actively realize it is, but it may be enough to push you over the edge when you're very uncertain about where you want to go play. You're a defensive back and you're trying to decide where to go to college. You might try to figure out if there are any starting positions available for you. You might just look around campus and see if you like what it looks like. Do you think it's an attractive place to go? And marijuana is just another thing on that list that could push some person over the edge. And so maybe we're talking about only 2 to 5% of people that are swayed by that decision. That's a small number, but that could be more important than, for example, did they get a new weight room?
Right. And you can see that schools care about this because you can see how they handle recruiting. I mean, the Louisville example is maybe my favorite as a Kentucky PhD. the Louisville example is maybe my favorite example. I mean, they were literally bringing in prostitutes in an organized way when they recruited, student athletes, essentially because they knew on the margin, again, that if we have more attractive ladies, maybe that's enough to get one more kid to say yes to come to Louisville and play basketball, meaning they have to live in Louisville. But, anything they can do on the margin to get people interested in the school. I mean, imagine you're trying to decide between UGA and Alabama. They're both football powerhouses. You're looking for any differentiating factor, right? Anything that sets them apart, little fringe benefits. So if marijuana happens to be a thing you enjoy or you want to avoid, that may just be the little thing that decides it.
I like the way that that's framed. Another thing that occurs to me in that case is what you just said now. Recruits tend to be targeted by similar tier of program, right? Yes. I'm not often deciding between Alabama and Akron. Right. So it's I'm deciding between Louisville and Kentucky or Georgia and Alabama, or if I'm a really top recruit, Ohio State and Alabama and Georgia, they're all fighting over me.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. And so maybe I think that can really highlight maybe why on the margin that's going to matter. So I had two questions. One is it's a bit of a I won't say non sequitur, but a tangential thing is I've always thought that the importance of like the uniforms that teams play in is underrated. And so I always, of course, think of Oregon in this case, because I think they've got to win some recruiting battles out West. Yes. Because the Oregon's uniforms are so ridiculous and so cool, and there's so many of them, and they really play with that in a way. And maybe I'm biased because I'm a University of Oklahoma guy, and so I'm thinking about Big 12 and SEC football, and as a big college football fan, I'm going to take in some more Big 10, and so the poor Pac-12 is over there and I'm ignoring them. But those are not the best uniforms in the country, so maybe they have like a really big advantage on the margin with Oregon. You guys have any thoughts about that before I kind of turn back?
That's a paper I thought about trying to write, actually. But the difficulty, of course, is they switch some of these schools switch uniforms so frequently.
Oregon's a good example.
Yeah, and some never change them at all. Right. So you have got no variation there. Mm-hmm. But I think that's a great example, again, of at the margins, these kind of the things, they do matter. And you've probably seen the reaction videos where they display the new jerseys that they're going to have for a home game, and the players just go absolutely wild. You or I, maybe we wouldn't care. I don't know. If I was an athlete, I'd be like, who cares? Let's go out there and let's play. Right. But it obviously matters to them. And maybe marijuana is like that too. Maybe you or I wouldn't care if it's legal or not in the college we choose, but some do. Some do care about that.
And they even differentiate in even more obscure ways. Think about like Boise State's blue field.
Yeah.
Is it possible somebody's like, oh, that's so unique, maybe I should play football there? Or like, which basketball team is it that has all the redwoods and trees all over their basketball
court? Is it Stanford?
I can't remember, but there's a couple of basketball teams I think that have just like
Oregon's
these
got
absurd,
a wild one too.
Yeah, just absurd. Their court is absurd.
Yeah,
and it's just one more differentiation.
Yeah, the court design thing had really taken off in, I don't know, maybe the last 5 years or something like that. Where, I remember when the wildest thing that used to happen on a basketball court was like San Antonio Spurs with the different colors in the middle logo, and that was like it. Yeah. And now I've seen some basketball courts where it's almost hard to watch the game.
Yes.
The floor underneath the players is so busy.
Right. Yep.
So that's an interesting one. Okay. So what I wanted to go, you explicitly mentioned, okay, you can't pay the players. That's still true, but now we have name, image, likeness. And so, we haven't been so explicit about it, but the motivation for the whole podcast is I saw you guys present a paper at a conference, one of my all-time favorite papers at any conference, as you might expect because of the topic, but also because of the excellence of your work. But so in one sense, that's probably you're studying a different time period explicitly in the paper. So we can kind of get into that if you want, but comment more generally, how do you expect name, image, likeness, and the fact that players are getting paid now, they're just not getting paid directly from the university? How do you expect that to factor in?
My daughter actually is a D1 athlete at Tech. She's on the cheer squad.
Georgia Tech. Yeah.
Sorry, Georgia Tech. The only Tech that matters, but Georgia Tech. But
see, I'm here in Texas, so you said Tech, and I thought Texas.
Right. They don't count. So she actually has teammates that actively use Instagram to market themselves, even though they have no product to market, on the anticipation by the time they are seniors that they can become like a spokesperson for like an energy drink. So one of their seniors actually gets a considerable amount of money as a marketer for some good tasting energy drink that they then provide at like campus events and so forth. So there definitely is an incentive for that. And then we see the, is it the Cavender twins that are at Miami? Is that the name? I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but they are just marketing wizards. So the fact that Miami gave them the best NIL options is how they ended up with the basketball team that has two very talented, very marketable players. They pull off an upset in the women's tournament. Suddenly they're even bigger names, even bigger NIL deals. So I think it's definitely something that's going to continue to grow. Again, as a Kentucky guy, Shibwe, I think, broke $1 million in NIL deals, if I'm not mistaken. It's some absurdly large number. They had to work through like his legal status since he was an international player. But I mean, he may not have been at Kentucky last year or this year, however you want to determine, since their season is over, unfortunately, if they didn't have those deals. So I think that people are going to continue to find ways to massage those rules. I know Miami football got some blowback for the way they handled it because I think they used pretty considerable amounts of money, sort of indirectly. But I think that's definitely going to continue, especially high level football and basketball. I think they're going to be continuous.
Yeah, and I think my gut reaction is that something like NIL is going to reduce the importance of something like marijuana legalization. Because now I know it's not direct compensation. I know it's probably not getting anywhere near to their marginal revenue product of labor, what they're worth in a free market.
Right.
But if I'm now choosing among schools, this is probably something that I care a lot about, the potential NIL deals. And so somebody out there, they're listening to it. Hopefully they don't scoop us on this. Josh Pitts is a frequent co-author of mine at Kennesaw State. We just started a project where we're trying to figure out, for example, are recruits more likely to go to big market teams now because of NIL deals? I would assume Georgia Tech being an example, I would assume Georgia Tech is in a pretty good position because if you're near a large city, there's probably more value and more opportunities from an NIL standpoint.
Right.
And so if I'm choosing among schools now, marijuana legalization may be something I care about. Chick-fil-A opportunities may be something I care about. But if you're offering me an NIL deal that's 50 grand more than another institution, that probably pushes me over.
It's going to be hard for somebody to love marijuana enough to turn down that.
Right.
That'd be a differential, maybe. But again, I still think on the margin it could matter if you're getting similar offers.
Yep.
And I think we like to think about players like Tashigwe or I forgot the name of the really high profile quarterback that went to Miami. That was the really big kerfuffle earlier in the year. But these guys were thinking about $1 million, but probably most of the offensive line on a Division I school is getting 10 or 25 or 50.
Yeah.
And they're probably getting something similar somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
It occurs to me there might be some kind of like income effect there where marijuana, maybe it's not cheap. I don't know. I can admit to having tried marijuana, but I'm not a regular user of it. So I don't have any sense of what the cost of marijuana is.
I don't know.
But so maybe there's a different way that could interact. Comments on that before I go forward.
My understanding is actually some of the schools have set up group deals on the NILs. So they'll like chunks of the team all receive benefits. They could kind of distribute it that way. And then some schools are handling it differently. So it could be interesting to look, because you can imagine that the fringe matters more when everyone's getting the same base and matters less at schools where you get these specialized deals. So it could be the case that you're right about like if the offensive linemen get the $10,000, but in some schools you have offensive linemen who could be first round draft picks. Maybe they get a significant amount of money. So that would be an interesting way to look at interesting levels of variation, like an interaction between the two potentially.
I was listening to a podcast on my way into the office this morning, right? And they were talking about, there's this really talented interior lineman, a guard. And they were like, he's really talented, right? But the upside for guards is second round, right? So you're not going to go on the first round if you're a guard almost ever. And in fact, it's pretty rare even for centers, right? But if you're a left tackle and you're the best, you could be the number one pick.
Yes.
Right. Absolutely. And so that if you want to attract that kind of talent, which the kind of schools that we've mentioned so far, they definitely do.
Yes.
So can you kind of walk us through legalization timelines and maybe comment a little bit on the difference between places that have legalized in like a medicinal sense and what kind of impact that might have, and where it's actual recreational uses in play?
So this was the first thing that we asked ourselves when we considered the topic: is there actually enough variation to even estimate a model? And we didn't know. So we kind of dug around. The answer is there's a lot of variation, actually. Currently, I think it's about 21 states have legalized recreational marijuana. More have done medical. The first ones that did true recreational were Colorado and Washington. That was 2012. And then since then, it's kind of just steadily grown to that 21 that we have now. So medical can come in multiple forms. Recreational also can come in multiple forms, but medical marijuana can be the non-hallucinogenic version. So CBD is usually what that's referred to as. Cannabinoid oil, I believe is how you say that. That's what Georgia generally has. This is non-hallucinogenic. There are other medicinal reasons to use it. Supposedly, I don't know really if that's been tested by anybody meaningfully. And then you get psychoreactive, and then you get the interesting variants of legal, not really traditional THC versions, so the Delta 8s, Delta 9s that are hallucinogenic to some extent, but are not traditional marijuana. And then you get the fully recreational marijuana, and then the medical with true psychoreactive. So there's a lot of variation. The recent trend has obviously been toward recreational legalization, which has been happening pretty rapidly. And then there's the weird outlier called decriminalization, which means that it's still illegal, but you don't go to jail anymore. You just pay a small fine for possession below certain limits. And I imagine that the effects on recruiting are potentially different across the different variants of that. And then especially if you think in terms of recreational, some places it's legal to grow, legal to sell, legal to buy, legal to consume. Some places only subsets of that are legal. My favorite example that I actually talk about in one of my freshman classes, I believe it's Maine, that for a while it was legal to possess and use marijuana, but you could not sell it. Mm-hmm. So a company started, they called it psychic marijuana services or something like that. And you would call them and say, where did I lose my marijuana? And for a fee, they would tell you where you lost it. And they would show up the same time you were there and drop the bag on the ground and you picked it up, which is genius, by the way.
Yeah, so markets always find a way, right?
They always find a way. So there's interesting variation in kind of in every level in how this stuff works. So you can imagine potentially that states that find a way to make it relatively easy to obtain recreationally versus states that make it recreationally available but not as easy to obtain. There could be differential impacts on the way people consume. And those continually change over time. So places that have legalized it one way have modified it continually. And of course, the market has grown dramatically. It's a gigantic market, and states continue to add. I think it grew pretty rapidly during COVID. It's a multi-$100 million industry now. And I think it'll continue to do that.
So it occurs to me, actually, there could be quite different reasons for athletes. I think your first reaction is, oh, they want recreational marijuana, mm-hmm. right? And they want that psychoreactive, but these are high level athletes for whom recovery from workouts and from, especially in football, mm-hmm. from battering into other 300-pound muscle freaks, mm-hmm. Is going to take a toll on their body. Sure. So even something like the CBD, I would expect that could have a really big impact if for whatever reason, especially if I have some kind of experience with that, which is hard to say a high school athlete what that's going to look like. But I might really want that. Right. That might be a critical part of my recovery.
We did not find much evidence that medical had an impact, is my recollection. We focused more on recreational because we were thinking of it more in terms of that fringe benefit that's more of an entertainment element. But we did look at medical, and I don't remember us having anything statistically significant. Some were maybe marginal in a few instances. To be fair, some of the results we find for recreational also on the margin. But I think medical was generally not statistically significant. Although, again, this is changing over time. So with more years, if COVID hadn't kind of messed with a few years of data, but in a few years, there may be some interesting additional questions to ask, more like fine grained versions of legalization.
So you do have a long time. Did you say when the first legalization was happening in Colorado?
2012 was Colorado and Washington State, and then the next year was Alaska, Oregon, DC, and then it kind of just blew up after that.
Okay, so you really do have a good long timeline of over a decade, and
Right.
then you've got, well, I mean, I don't know how much is in your paper. We're over a decade now.
Yes.
And then you've got quite a bit of variation. One of the things I do try to teach my students is you can't explain variation with lack of variation. Can you talk just a little bit about why the variation is important and you care about it for your study?
So the example I would use is if you think about trying to compare states, if only states that are of a similar type legalize marijuana, then you have very little variation to exploit outside of differences in the states. So if it was just Colorado, Washington, and Oregon, very West Coast, very liberal states, you may not have enough variation to actually do anything meaningful if you want to look nationally. So what you need some legalization in other areas, right? So when you start to get Michigan's different from California, right? So once you control for the differences in the states that are underlying, because there is actual variation in the characteristics of the state in other ways, then that leaves you some variation in legalization to exploit. So you can start to see meaningful variation when you start to expand out and get more and more states that have legalized. Now, this can sometimes cause problems with estimation techniques, but I think we've done a decent job of addressing those. But there are some fairly advanced techniques that let you kind of exploit minute variations and also really recent changes. We don't have to do that because we've got, again, stuff going back farther, but there are some ways to do that. But yeah, without variation, like if we just had one state that legalized and that state was unique in a lot of other different ways, it would be nearly impossible to disentangle what was the marijuana effect and what was just the Oregon effect. Or like if we were looking at crack legalization effects, there's only one state that has legalized crack possession in essence. So there'd be no real variation to exploit in a case like that, unless we did very careful edge cases. Right. And I don't know if I'd want a basketball player that was choosing based on crack availability.
Yeah, you'd have to do something where, that kind of classic diff and diff over a border kind of thing.
Yeah.
Which is probably actually much harder and messier in this case than it would be in some of the classic papers. And
potentially, yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about the legalization and the marijuana and whatnot. Can we talk about like some of the other end? And why'd you pick recruiting, and why is that important? Why did you focus on that?
So recruiting is something that I've done a lot of research on. I have probably 8 or 10 papers regarding recruiting, and it seemed like an interesting place to go because I'm the one that has the data, and I don't know if anybody else has been dumb enough to go out and try to collect all the data. And now I'm at a point where I can't ignore my son calls. I've collected all the data, and I'm like, I got to keep collecting it now,
Yeah.
So we have all the football and basketball recruiting. I've worked quite a bit on this area of research. And it seemed like an interesting place to go, again, because I'm always interested in recruiting because of that on the margins thing we mentioned before. These players aren't getting paid, but they're worth a tremendous amount of value to their institution. For example, if a player gets taken to a 5-star recruit, so we're talking to the very upper echelon player, they're worth more than $600,000 per year to that institution, and that institution is not supposed to be paying those players. So it matters a lot, and this is not something that can just be explained away by salary like it can be in a lot of other industries. So it seemed like an interesting place to go because this is something that matters quite a bit to the institution. If a team reaches the Sweet 16, for example, in basketball, they get far more applications. Their average SAT scores go up. Their enrollment goes up. There's just these huge benefits to the institution. And so I'm interested in it simply because I want to know, is marijuana legalization, which is largely exogenous, something that the institution can't control, is this affecting decision making? So to me, it was an interesting question. And when I first mentioned it to Chris, I can't remember who actually came up with the idea, but when we first discussed it, he was like, okay, well, let's do this. This sounds great. And I'm thinking, this sounds terrible. I really don't want to do this because I assumed we'd find absolutely no effect. I really didn't think we'd find anything. And so I was pretty surprised by the results myself.
My favorite result, actually, of some of Brent's work on recruiting is he found that recruiting violations, even after you've been caught, improve recruiting in the future. Mm. So these schools are doing everything to recruit these players. So anything that has an impact, they're going to go after. So if they believe that marijuana has an impact on recruiting, I guarantee you these kids know that marijuana is legal in that state when they they finish their campus visits.
Yeah.
So do you think there's a signaling mechanism at play? You think if you get caught for recruiting violations, recruits go, those guys, they give out the good stuff? Or
I think that could be going on, or it may just be a signal of what's happening that's otherwise unobservable, right? So these schools are probably breaking a lot of rules, and you're only catching them on a small fraction. And so when a school gets caught, it's probably hiding, behind closed doors, many other violations that are actually occurring.
I mean, use UNC, for example. In my recollection is they got caught with academic fraud allegations for like 20 years, maybe 30 years of academic fraud. And I think their punishment was, please don't do that anymore.
Yeah.
Which means that if I'm a kid who's going to college and I'm on the margin academically, and UNC offers me, and I know they're going to have this huge network that they never get in trouble for, I'm going to go, all right, well, they're going to write my papers for me.
Yeah.
I don't even have to even learn how to use the AI. I can just have them write papers for me, and they go to UNC, on the margin.
Yeah, so maybe the playing field has been leveled with a chat GPT.
Maybe, yeah.
Okay, so I wanna ask, this is kind of a out there kind of question because I have no idea. You did say legalization is exogenous to the universities. You think there's any chance that universities are lobbying for legalization in their state at all? Because universities do a surprising amount of lobbying.
Yeah,
I don't know how much of that is state and how much of that is national. But maybe there's some policy endogeneity there. What do you think?
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. So, I mean, to kind of spoiler alert here a little bit for the paper. So what we find is that states that legalize marijuana improve their basketball recruiting, and their football recruiting gets worse. So I would say, based on information, if I'm in an institution that has Division I basketball but doesn't have Division I football, I might think that legalizing marijuana is something that we could benefit from. So there's a case to be made, and that's just for college athletes, right? I imagine colleges in general may benefit from the students that they bring in, and that's a paper that also we may try to consider writing in the future. Does it affect just general applicants to universities? So I think that they might be willing to try to lobby, but I also could imagine that they don't want people to know that they're trying to do that, just because it could be bad press.
Maybe you don't want to do that, if you're in a more conservative area.
Yeah,
but it might look really good if I'm in Oregon or Washington State or Colorado,
right?
And then it's like, okay, I'm that might be more acceptable there,
right?
So yeah, there's some. We'll get into this because I want to ask you about some of that kind of the political environment and different things.
Well, I would imagine that the schools may lobby to try to get it legalized for enrollment purposes, so forth. Based on my understanding of how coaches operate, they are the most risk-averse human beings on the planet.
Yes.
So without knowing in advance what the impact of legalization would be on their team in terms of performance, recruiting, etc., I would be very surprised if they were pushing either way for legalization or not, for sports-related reasons. Now, the schools could do it because they might expect enrollment to go up.
Yeah.
But like Nick Saban, from what I understand, is basically a robot. So I cannot imagine that he's waking up one day and going, you know what, this might work. Let's roll the dice. I don't think that's how he operates. So I don't imagine it's a lot of sports related lobbying. Now, maybe they read this paper and they believe it.
Sure.
Our dream comes true and people pay attention. Then maybe, but I think preemptively, if they have no idea what the impact would be, they don't seem like the kind of people who are going to gamble. So I'd be surprised if it's for sports.
I like that answer a lot. And the reason that I think that's a really great answer is, risk aversion, especially when you've made it to the top.
Yes.
So there's no way Saban or Kirby Smart, they don't want to risk anything, right? Except maybe in some weird cases, because my family's from Kentucky, so I'm actually a Kentucky Wildcat basketball fan as well. So maybe Calipari's getting ready to take some risks because it looks like he may be on his way out, despite being pretty successful even in recent years. He raised the bar too high. He couldn't even keep up with his past success. But so maybe he's like a somewhat odd case.
Mm-hmm.
And then if I'm a head football coach or a head basketball coach at somewhere where I would be willing to take more risks because I want to move up the ladder into those, I probably don't have the pull with the universities or with definitely with the state legislatures where that's going to matter. Yeah. So that's a really great answer. That's a very clever answer. So unless you had a comment on that.
Thank you for telling me I'm clever. I appreciate that.
Yeah, of course.
I don't get
So,
enough compliments, so I appreciate it.
so you mentioned right at the start, right? So there might be these two different mechanisms. Enjoy, we might enjoy marijuana and therefore want to indulge ourselves as a student athlete. We might enjoy marijuana and realize probably not great for my long-term prospects in life and health. Right. And so let me go somewhere where they'll kind of take that away from me. Talk about why you think that might be the case. And then, as Brent alluded to, you've kind of got some results that fit with that narrative a little bit, and talk about that interaction.
Yeah. So going into the paper again, I wasn't sure if we'd find any significance at all of that, and I figured we'd find nothing. So I think there is running the risk a little bit of finding a result and then trying to explain what that result is. So I'll just say that disclaimer up front. But I can imagine that if I'm somebody who uses marijuana already, that going to a place where I'm not going to get arrested for it could be really valuable. So if I'm somebody who uses marijuana frequently and I'm a high-end basketball player, the potential cost of getting caught using marijuana is just so high if I'm in a state like Georgia. So there's many cases of students that have used marijuana and it's affected their draft status. It's caused them to miss games and during a college season. And the stakes are just really high for these 5-star players. So anything that might put their future at risk, I can imagine you're trying to do something to avoid it. So that explains to me why somebody might want to go to a state that has legal marijuana. I think the opposite case is a little bit harder to explain. Why would recruiting improve when a state doesn't legalize marijuana? And so, as Chris was alluding to earlier, it's possible that I'm somebody who knows that I might use marijuana. I don't want to be tempted by it. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to go to a state that doesn't have it legally, and I'm hoping I'm not going to be around other students that are using it. Or maybe conversely, my parents don't want me to go to a state that has legal marijuana.
So I would say one of the reasons I think we may find different results for football and basketball is because football, there have actually been instances in the draft where just the rumors of marijuana use were enough to knock people down the rankings. So Randy Moss is a classic example, I think. Warren Sapp, who literally said after the draft, I'm going to punish everyone who didn't draft me, and then ended up in the Hall of Fame. And then the one that I actually found out about while we were writing the paper is Dan Marino. I had never heard that Marino had slid down the rankings because of some rumors, maybe not necessarily just marijuana, but just general rumors. And he had dropped down the rankings a little bit. Again, another Hall of Famer. That's 3 Hall of Famers who were drafted lower because of rumors about the behavior. I have never heard of an instance of that in basketball where people were significantly punished in terms of draft or compensation. The Atlanta Hawks had a couple years ago somebody who was borderline catatonic after eating too many edibles. Yeah. Who was that? You remember?
I don't remember.
But he ate so many edibles on a flight back to Atlanta that they had to like wheel him out of the plane, and there were no fines. There were basically no consequences, is my recollection. So what's interesting is basketball, it seems to be borderline acceptable to use it. Football, there seems to still be a stigma. So it could be the case that in football, legality, even if it's recreationally available, if I just am obviously using, even if I'm not breaking a law, it may be enough to have an impact.
Yeah, and in regards to punishment at the NBA and NFL level, things have been subdued quite a bit. So if you get caught with marijuana, it's not you don't get punished like you did, say, 10 years ago. But we're looking at a data set that goes from 2002 to 2019. And during that entire time stretch, the punishment for being caught using marijuana was much stronger in the NFL than it was in the NBA. So you can imagine that if I'm a player that maybe uses marijuana, that if I'm forward looking, thinking about my professional future, I don't want to get caught using marijuana, especially if I'm wanting to get drafted in the NFL. Mm-hmm. It's a bad signal to those that might draft me.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask, right? The hard part of those kind of results is not just saying, well, there's reasons players might want it and players might not, but also mapping those reasons onto your results in terms of, so that's a very excellent answer, because I would think that would be the hard part, which is probably why you guys spend much time thinking
Yeah,
about
that our first edition of the paper, I was really agnostic about these things. I just wanted to say, here are the results and let the reader decide.
Right.
Referees didn't let us get away with that. So we had to try to provide some sort of explanation. But I think I would also just say we don't know why that's the result really.
Right.
But there is a result. There's a significant result. I trust our econometrics. So it seems like there's something going on there.
And I will point out that football is only marginally significant.
Yeah.
It's not 1% level or whatever. So it's only marginally significant. So we're not saying that this is massive and that we're 100% confident that this is occurring.
Yeah.
We're saying we find some evidence that it has an impact for football, for example. And then that's sort of the narrative that we think makes some sense. We are definitely open to the idea that there's something more subtle happening that we don't catch. We're just using our knowledge. Neither one of us played D1 sports. I don't know if you can tell by looking at us. But that's just our interpretation of the situation.
Yeah, the case for basketball is a lot stronger than for football.
Yes.
So let's talk about that. Talk to me about kind of contextualize the magnitude of what you find, the significance, and kind of help the listeners understand, what did you find? Are we talking about enormous effects or kind of small, medium effects? Talk about that a little bit.
So we use recruiting rankings as our dependent variable. So what we're trying to basically figure out is if you're in a state that has legalized marijuana, controlling for a host of other factors, does that affect your recruiting rank? And so in college basketball, where the case is, we think, stronger, if you're in a state that has legalized marijuana, you recruit at about 3.5 to 4 ranking slots better. So maybe you're a school that otherwise would have been ranked 40th. Now you're ranked 36 in the recruiting rankings on average. That effect is pretty large. For example, that effect is larger than, or it's more than half as large as the effect of having a new coach. So normally we think of having a new coach as being very detrimental to a team. It's not only, it's a signal of a team that's had poor performance and there's a lot of turmoil generally. And also it means you're probably not winning right away. So that negative effect of a new coach is real. It's been documented in many past papers. Our research shows that the effect of marijuana is more than half as large of that effect, to kind of put it in a term that makes a little bit of sense. College football is about the exact opposite, but the significance is more questionable. So college football, your recruiting gets 3 or 4 ranking slots worse if you're in a state with legalized marijuana. And again, that's about half the size of the effect of a new coach.
I actually have a college football recruiting paper that's in Journal of Sports Economics. And one of the things that we do in that paper is we have a variable, right, trying to control for head coaches. But what we did is we went back, I can't remember if we had it's been a minute since I wrote this paper. We had a variable for whether the coach leaves, or like whether they get poached or whether they get fired.
Oh, cool. Yeah, that's cool.
Kind of gets at that. So I'll send the paper along after we get off here. And you can add that to your little
there we go.
data set.
You might get cited a bunch of times.
Yeah, power up your paper. Good for you, good for me. So do you think there's I was trying to think of like other reasons that we could explain it. I like your answer, and I think it probably is the best. But I was trying to think if one of right, you've got different team sizes, you've got maybe different cultures that you're pulling from. It's hard for me to exactly put my finger on this, right? But like one way that would be kind of a crude way to think about it is, maybe college basketball is pulling from more urban areas and college football might be pulling from more rural areas. And maybe those kind of explain some differences in the way that athletes and their families, as you alluded to earlier, might feel about that. Maybe it's one of those things where how many players are on a college basketball team? Like 15 or 20, somewhere in there.
Yeah, 15.
So maybe that is driving some of the effect. Half-baked ideas. So I'm just kind of throwing that out there. But
yeah, and also you might think of as alcohol and marijuana as substitutes. And generally speaking, there's a bigger cost to gaining weight, specifically gaining fat, for a basketball player than it would be for a football player. Yeah. So maybe I would like to use a drug. Alcohol and marijuana are 2 possibilities. For a basketball player, maybe you don't want to use beer. Maybe you don't want to drink beer because you might gain some weight, and that's much more problematic. If you're an offensive lineman, maybe you don't care about gaining the weight, so you're okay with drinking the beer, so you don't worry about marijuana legalization. That might be another possibility of what's driving the results.
That is very interesting. Thinking about what all the different substitutes might be.
Sure.
For especially a recreational use, because I think if you'd asked me this question, I would have guessed the other way. And the reason, because I wouldn't have thought immediately of what you were talking about, is because of that sort of dual effect of you could potentially use marijuana in at least somewhat legitimate medical way and for recovery purposes. And I would think that would matter a lot more in football. So that kind of, when I saw the paper, that kind of ran counter to my intuition. So yeah, having some good reasons for that, I think is really critical. So you've got a good, as you alluded to, you've got kind of a good coverage of different states and different regions. Do you explore that at all? Like different, maybe there's, like you said earlier, different West Coast culture versus South versus Midwest versus East Coast. Do you guys get into that at all?
So we do that with a set of fixed effects. So essentially, we're just controlling for inherent differences in the states and underlying schools. So California just inherently being different. Now, if those things change over time, that the fixed effect won't catch that. But we do control, of course, say the quality of the team. We know how they performed last year. So we're tracking how the team is doing over time, which obviously has an impact on recruiting. And we do keep time trends captured also, so national level time trends. So if marijuana, for example, is just becoming more acceptable nationally, then that's going to get captured by the time trend. Or if the way recruiting happens is just evolving naturally at national level, the time trend catches that. We don't catch things that vary across the schools, the states, et cetera, over time. One of the referees actually on the most recent round said, well, what about this? And then he goes, but maybe your fixed effect catches that. And in our head, we were like, you're right. We agree with you, referee. Maybe the fixed effect catches that. So the argument would be simply the cultural elements that is, a state hasn't evolved that dramatically in terms of just raw culture over the last, say, 15 years. But there could be subtle changes that we would not otherwise be able to pick up without having to just throw away all the fixed effects, for example, which I think is not a good trade-off econometrically.
Yeah, I was trying to think of, it matters, as you talked about, when different states legalize, but it also matters like where you're at relative to that. So I don't know the legalization like timelines off the top of my head, but let's think about Oklahoma, Texas, or Georgia, Florida, right? Some of these places where there's big time programs, and then there's really hot recruiting beds where we really care about getting players out of Florida or getting players out of Texas. And then you've got big time programs, if I can toot our own horn, Oklahoma and Georgia, and we're trying to recruit out of those places. And then it's like, I was neither of these are good examples because I don't think Florida and Texas are legalization places, but the reverse might also be true, right? So if I'm in Georgia and we legalize, then that should be a benefit of pulling Florida recruits potentially, or the reverse. But you're saying you kind of do this as a overall across the whole like environment of football recruiting.
Right. Now, it sounds like you were proposing there as a potential sort of next step for like another paper is do this at the player level rather than the team level.
Yes.
So look at player rating and kind of where they end up and control for the characteristics of that school. That is a much larger endeavor because it's a much larger sample, but that could be very interesting. So I believe Brent has had some research about the recruiting pool in a state affecting how recruiting happens. So if a state has more talent versus a state with less talent. So you could potentially do this paper from the player's point of view and see where they end up and try to figure out a model that works in that way. I can envision like a propensity score matching thing where you find players that are the same in every other way and see where they end up.
Yeah, and we do control for state level talent to some extent. So obviously, if there's a bunch of 5-star recruits in your state, you're more likely to get those than you are some, if they're from a state far away. So we do have just a rudimentary control there. But I think somebody a lot smarter than me or Chris is probably going to have to figure out a really good way to think about this at the individual player level. That is an endeavor I'm not willing to take on. I'm not going to lie to you. I've done a lot of recruiting research, and just about every time I submit a paper, a referee has a comment that's something like, well, you should really think about individual players. The scope on that is just unbelievably massive. I mean, we're talking in college basketball, which is a smaller data set. We're talking 250 players a year over 20, 25 years. And you're trying to think about each individual player and the choice they make. That is really difficult for me. So I think aggregating it, you lose. There's some potential risk with aggregating it econometrically, but I think it makes the story clean, and it definitely makes it much more manageable for the researchers.
Right. And this is one of the things you're one of the first papers, or as far as I know, the first paper really looking at this, right? So you kind of want to introduce the topic,
sure,
get the conversation going, and if some really ambitious grad student down the road reads your paper, they can be the ones to do the player data. So okay, so we're coming up on an hour or so here, so I kind of want to bring it in for a landing. But I really want to talk about this idea you mentioned in the paper, does political environment matter? So I want to get your take on that, and then a discussion of sort of like not just the nature of the state itself and whether it's red or blue or purple or whatever, compared to like just recruiting maybe in the South itself.
Okay. Yeah. So first, to kind of discuss the results, I was really concerned with, when we did our first set of regressions, I was concerned with maybe marijuana legalization was correlated with the state's political leaning. So states that are generally more blue leaning have historically been the ones that have legalized marijuana. And also kind of looking at the data, the states that have legalized marijuana have generally continuously gotten more left leaning through time. So like a state like Colorado, for example, they used to be primarily a red state. And as they got more blue, marijuana legalization occurred, and they've gotten bluer and bluer through time. So my concern was, maybe if you're a college athlete, maybe you care about a state's political leaning, and that's so highly correlated with marijuana that if we don't control for a state's political leaning, we basically are capturing the wrong result, right? In other words, marijuana legalization is basically just a proxy for a state's political leaning. So we created a couple of variables to control for that, really simple variables. And what we found was that in college basketball, a state that was more blue, and it was getting bluer over time, those states recruited better in basketball, and they recruited worse in football. And that's even after controlling for marijuana legalization and all the other controls in our data set. So maybe that's indicative of political policies or political beliefs mattering, or maybe that's also just capturing something about the way that society is oriented. But it kind of is an interesting result, and maybe something we might explore in the future. Do recruits care about politics? Because I don't think there's any research on that right now.
And I think it's worth noting that the marijuana legality variable remains statistically significant, and roughly the same magnitude after controlling for political affiliation in the states. So it survived the test, if you will. In terms of how recruiting may differ by region, again, the state fixed effect will catch inherent differences in region, because, Georgia's always in the South. It doesn't always want to admit, Atlanta's a little different from the rest of the state, if you will, but it just is where it is. Now, if there's something that is inherently causing recruiting to change over time in a region that is not determined by things like performance, which we control for, then we're missing this omitted variable, whatever this unmeasurable heterogeneity, like whatever it is, we're not going to be able to catch that piece. Now we could throw in like conference variables that are interacted with time, but the problem is, if you have state fixed effects or team fixed effects, then all you're picking up is variation because of teams moving into or out of conferences. So if a team moves in to the SEC, welcome, by the way, into the SEC, then they may have better or worse recruiting than they had before, or they may just be better or worse recruiters than the other teams in that conference, whichever way. But any identification we get for those conference variables, because we have school fixed effects, would be from entry and exit. So it wouldn't necessarily be that conference is getting better or worse over time. It just has different teams in it. So it's tough to disentangle those two pieces. The only way you could do anything with a conference time trend is if you scrapped the team fixed effects, which you then create a whole lot of new omitted variables that you can't control for. So it's kind of a chicken or an egg, the argument, which goes back to the referee who was like, maybe you already had that in the fixed effects. And we just like high-fived him virtually in our heads when he wrote that in the referee report.
And that is something we're concerned with, you
Sure.
know, but we just don't have a good explanation or good fix for it.
Yeah.
My guests today have been Brent Evans and Chris Clark. Gentlemen, thanks for joining me on the EconBuff.
Thank you for having us
Thanks a lot.
and calling us smart a couple of times.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the EconBuff. You can find all previous episodes on YouTube at EconBuff Podcast. You can check out our website at econbuffpodcast.wixsite.com. That's WIXSIT.com. You can contact us at econbuffpodcast@yahoo.com.